And 30 new cases of coronavirus amid questions about the future of the lockdown.
Unfortunately, when a small number of people do the wrong thing, it does result in extra cases.
Also, the Federal Health Minister hits back at one of his state counterparts who's compared the vaccine rollout to the Hunger Games. The FBI investigating a new ransomware attack which hit thousands of companies worldwide over the weekend. And a history-making team announced to represent Australia at the Olympic Games in Tokyo. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Hamish Macdonald. It's been another eventful day on the coronavirus front across the country, with dozens more cases detected in New South Wales, Western Australia and South Australia easing restrictions, and the tension between the states and Commonwealth officials over the vaccine rollout going up another notch. Here's the latest from around the country. New South Wales announced 35 new cases of local transmission today. 11 of those were still out in the community while infectious. While the number of cases yet to come down, the state government says the next few days will be critical to whether or not the lockdown is eased on Friday. Queensland has recorded 4 new local cases of COVID-19, all linked to the previous alpha strain detections, which the Premier says is good news. Authorities believe there is no Delta variant in the state. South Australia has dropped the snap COVID restrictions it introduced last week, prompted by the multiple outbreaks around the nation. Western Australia is moving to less restrictions faster than previously planned after the state recorded no new cases overnight. And Tasmania has moved the high-risk declaration for Western Australia and the Northern Territory. People from those areas are now able to travel to Tasmania without quarantining. To Sydney now, where another 2 aged care residents have tested positive for coronavirus. Reporter Tim Swanston is with us now, or spoke to us earlier, but we'll bring you more from him later. I think what we might do now is cross to Ashley Raper if she's standing by and see if she's ready to talk to us in Sydney. Are you there, Ashley? Let's just see if Ashley Raper is there. Can we speak to you now, Ashley?
Special.
Not sure if Ashley is ready to go.
These remain anxious times at this aged care home at Baulkham Hills.
We're very saddened, of course, that we have 2 additional cases. I want to extend my best wishes to all of our residents that are currently in Westmead.
5 residents have now been infected and all have been moved to Westmead Hospital as a precaution. Both new cases are women in their 70s. One is fully vaccinated, the other is not, because she moved into the home after the vaccinations were done.
I can only express my understanding to the families of people in that facility, but please, I'd like to assure them that there is a lot of attention to doing everything we can to prevent any further transmission.
There's attention too on the low levels of vaccinations among aged care workers after the virus was brought in by 2 staff members.
But up until 7 days ago, we were unable to insist our staff are vaccinated.
We asked the National Cabinet to give us advice on whether we could make it mandatory. National Cabinet has said mid-September is the deadline.
New South Wales says, though, the biggest issue is still supply.
We now have almost a sense now of the Hunger Games, of people chasing vaccine.
Overall, there are 35 new locally acquired cases. 33 are linked. 20 are in fact household contacts of previous cases. The source of 2 cases is unknown, and 11 cases were out in the community while infectious. Of the new cases, 1 is a student at Rose Bay Public School.
We're not exactly sure about the full infectious period, but that person may have been infectious at school.
At this stage, students are still scheduled to return to classes next week, although likely under stricter rules.
As a general sense, some of the things that we have looked at are things that we've had in place earlier. You know, we try and minimise parents coming to drop off the schools. We try and prevent parent functions and gatherings.
While everything might still feel like it's up in the air, the Premier insists the lockdown is working. But it's unclear just how effective it's been and whether 2 weeks is enough.
I know everybody is keen to know what's going to happen beyond Friday's lockdown, as am I.
She's waiting for the health advice that won't be finalised until later this week. Ashley Raper, ABC News, Sydney.
Shaking their heads. The gathering in the city's inner south is still under investigation. Other people have been getting into trouble over their somewhat creative definition of exercising.
A COVID response again compromised by illegal gatherings. Police and health are looking into an alleged party at Meriton Suites in Mascot, now linked to 3 COVID cases.
I would say to those few people who are thinking that the rules are somehow not for them, that they're more entitled than the rest of us not to have to listen, well, no, you've actually got to listen, because you may be the people who actually spread this and keep us in lockdown for a lot longer than the rest of the community would like.
Anyone who's been inside at all from Saturday night, the 26th, to this morning must get tested, isolate and wait for further advice.
What we're looking at is ascertaining and tracking down everyone who was at that event.
But a viral witch hunt is what authorities want to avoid, to encourage COVID-positive people to fess up when they've done the wrong thing.
What we do appreciate is even when people have broken the rules, they're being very honest with health and letting us know your contacts, letting us know what's going on.
Similarly, there are calls for employers to support sick days for workers to get tested. Several construction sites across Sydney are considered exposure locations for all of last week because of confirmed cases. Sydney delivered a perfect winter weekend that was too good to pass up.
This city has over 5 million people. There were plenty of people out. I have heard plenty of comment around the number of people out.
It raised some eyebrows, putting police in a tough tug of war.
People need to understand that it's a real balance that police have to strike, and we will continue to do that.
Since the lockdown, 268 $1,000 fines have been issued and more than 300 infringements for not wearing masks. Residents have been slugged with more than $330,000 in fines. Outdoor recreation is considered a reasonable excuse to leave the house, and part of the confusion is working out exactly what that means. There's no clear line in the sand, so it's mostly up to people using their common sense and the discretion of police, who say they're balancing mental and physical health with the orders. Tim Swanston, ABC News, Sydney.
Let's go now to Ashley Raper, who's live in Sydney for us. Good evening to you, Ashley. The State's Health Minister, Brad Hazzard, must have known he'd grab some headlines with that line about the Hunger Games, but clearly he's increasingly frustrated about the vaccine rollout.
Yes, Hamish. The New South Wales government continues to push this argument that demand for the vaccine outweighs supply, and that needs to change. Last week, the first week of lockdown in New South Wales, 131,000 vaccines were administered in the state, which is a record for the 7-day period. There's now been 2.4 million vaccines given in New South Wales, but it's a long way off the 10 million target that has been set by the Premier Gladys Berejiklian. She insists that 80% of the adult population needs to be vaccinated before there's any discussion about opening international borders or life returning to normal. And Hamish, this Delta strain really adds to this current sense of urgency, simply in terms of protecting the community.
Ashley Raper, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Well, the NRL has issued breach notices to 13 St George Illawarra Dragons players who allegedly attended a party at the weekend. The breach notice issued to player Paul Vaughan, who organised the gathering, includes a $50,000 fine and an 8-match suspension. More than $300,000 in fines have been issued to players who attended.
The Dragons are in damage control. 13 players have been fined a total of $305,000 for their blatant COVID breach. The host of the illegal gathering in Shell Harbour, Paul Vaughan, has copped a $50,000 fine and been banned for 8 games. Jack de Bellin's also been caught out after telling police he wasn't involved.
When you hear of parties going on in the middle of a lockdown, you've got to say, what is the thinking of some of these people?
The 30-year-old's been back in the game for a month after a 3-year suspension for rape charges. He was found not guilty of one charge and the others were dropped. The NRL says when police arrived at the house, players hid and fled on foot.
It's disappointing when anybody does the wrong thing. It doesn't matter what your profession is. It's just disappointing because every time somebody knowingly, and I say knowingly, does the wrong thing, it jeopardises all the rest of us.
The Dragons' origin stars Tarek Sims and Ben Hunt have been cleared.
Cool, yeah. It's good to see. I think him and Ben Hunt sort of shows, I suppose, all the Dragons teammates can learn from those players that have been at the origin.
There's little sympathy from the playing group.
You just do it at your own risk, and obviously the court, so you just got to wear the punishment, and it is what it is. But, there's no judgment from me. It's just, if you do the crime, you got to do the time.
The NRL's harsh penalties aim to make an example of the players involved. Due to their past indiscretions, Jack de Bellin's been fined $42,000 and Corey Norman $50,000. All players that visited the house will be suspended for one game. With a bye this weekend, the Red V have a fortnight to decide who will take the field. Chloe Hart, ABC News, Sydney.
Well, Queensland has recorded 4 new locally acquired COVID cases, all linked to existing outbreaks, as more details are revealed about a new quarantine facility proposal close to Brisbane Airport. The Commonwealth has offered to pay for the construction of the 1,000-bed Pinkenbar facility, but the Queensland Government isn't giving up its push for a regional quarantine centre near Toowoomba.
The history of puzzling COVID-19 cases has become clearer overnight as life returns to a pandemic normal.
We're feeling pretty good at where we are at the moment.
7 new COVID-19 cases were confirmed, 4 of them local transmission, but the Chief Health Officer isn't worried.
All closely linked, and we can work through all those, and we'll be putting out any additional venues.
One, announced late yesterday, is a close contact of a case at the Greek Community Centre. Her child has also now tested positive. The other 2 new cases are the colleague and partner of the man who travelled to Yamundi.
All of these are the alpha strain. We do not believe that the Delta variant is circulating in our community, which is excellent news.
So too is that contact tracers may have found a missing link between 3 previous cases. It turns out they'd all been to the Zeus Street Greek Kitchen at Westfield Chermside at the same time.
We're just working out all of the specifics, but we think that is probably the site of transmission.
The Southeast Alpha variant cluster now stands at more than 20 and can be traced back to a leak from hotel quarantine. The Premier says the state could do away with using hotels altogether if the Commonwealth would commit to 2 standalone quarantine sites. The 2 governments are working through a new proposal at Pinkenbar near the Brisbane Airport, but Anastasia Palaszczuk is also pushing a private proposal at Wellcamp near Toowoomba, which fails to meet key federal government criteria.
Why don't you just give up on Wellcamp?
Because it's fully costed, it's ready to go, it could be built in 2 months.
No, that's not deemed a suitable facility at Toowoomba.
We believe the Damascus site is a far superior approach than Wellcamp.
The Pinkenbar facility could hold up to 1,450 people, with 800 people arriving per fortnight in the initial stages.
Which would allow roughly 2 repatriation flights, 2 Australian government repatriation flights a week to bring home those stranded Aussies.
But before the idea takes flight, there's weeks of detailed planning and squabbling ahead. Kate McKenna, ABC News, Brisbane.
Hundreds of GPs have begun administering the Pfizer vaccine as the government attempts to ramp up the lagging rollout. Just over 500 general practice clinics around the country are now offering the Pfizer vaccine. Before today, they could only give AstraZeneca, which is not recommended to people under the age of 60.
It means that we're actually getting to vaccinate more and more people in the different age groups. I mean, we're still running AstraZeneca and we'll be running Pfizer as well.
A further 800 GP clinics will come on board over the next few weeks, and the number is expected to continue to rise. The government will receive the bulk of Australia's Pfizer supply in October. Some 300 community pharmacies will be handling the rollout in remote and regional areas where there's no access to GPs. Still to come on ABC News this evening, the huge fees Australians pay on their superannuation revealed. Plus, a man in his 20s in a serious condition after a shark attack on the New South Wales mid-north coast. Well, Victoria's Casino Royal Commission has heard Crown Melbourne's chief executive knew about a potential tax rort in 2018, but only started investigating the day after the inquiry was announced. Xavier Walsh is the most senior executive to give evidence at the Commission so far, which is examining Crown's suitability to hold a licence for its South Bank casino.
Crown Melbourne's chief executive didn't want to answer questions on his way into the Royal Commission, but there were plenty to come about the possibility the company's been cheating on its taxes. Xavier Walsh has revealed he knew about a potential multi-million-dollar underpayment in 2018, but only did something about it a day after the Andrews government called the inquiry.
I'm trying to come to grips with why you did nothing from 2018. Like 3 years.
No, and that's a fair question. I mean, as I say,
I need an answer to the question.
Yeah, yes. I took comfort that those more senior than me were aware of it.
The Commission's heard Crown has potentially underpaid $200 million in gambling taxes as a result of a controversial deductions policy. Xavier Walsh raised the issue with Crown Resorts Executive Chairman Helen Coonan in February, and a day later asked a manager to calculate Crown's savings.
You were concerned that this issue, which you'd known about since 2018, might be exposed in this Royal Commission.
I was concerned about that, yes, at that point.
It was that prompted you to ask Mr Mackay to do the numbers on the 24th, rather than Ms Coonan's broad invitation to change the culture. Correct?
No, I disagree.
The details of the potential underpayment weren't disclosed to the regulator and only came to light because they were inadvertently sent to the Commission.
I'm asking you whether you believe that Crown has not cheated on its taxes.
I think there's a potential that we have.
Other senior Crown figures will give evidence this week. Jean Edwards, ABC News, Melbourne.
Detectives are investigating similarities between the murders of two Underworld figures in Sydney over the past year. Bilal Hamza was gunned down outside a Japanese restaurant in the city 8 months after his cousin Mejid Hamza was killed near his Condell Park home. Today, police released CCTV of 3 cars seen travelling together before and after the shooting in the city's southwest.
We're seeking to identify the people that were driving those vehicles, and we're also hoping to hear from witnesses or people that may have seen those vehicles.
Investigators still believe the shootings could be linked to an ongoing feud between the Hamzis and rival family, the Alameddines. There have been no arrests made over either murder. It's been just over a month since Rebecca White announced she was resigning the Tasmanian Labor leadership. But with the top job again up for grabs, the Lions MP is said to be the top pick among her colleagues to take on the role. Meanwhile, the party's acting leader and federal leader have both refused to comment on whether David O'Byrne was right to resign in response to claims of sexual harassment from his union days.
Out and about in Queensland, the federal Labor leader wasn't keen to turn his mind to matters down south. The Tasmanian branch is again on the hunt for a leader just weeks after appointing its last.
David O'Byrne has made that decision and that has occurred.
Mr O'Byrne announced his resignation on Sunday after the ABC last week revealed his party was investigating a sexual harassment claim. The Franklin MP says he thought kiss and text exchanges with a junior employee more than a decade ago were consensual, but now realises that wasn't the case.
What are you going to do to assure yourself that the Tasmanian branch doesn't have a serious problem with sexual harassment, as has been alleged by a separate complainant?
There are processes in place.
As for the woman who made the complaint about David O'Byrne,
she certainly doesn't feel supported at all. What is even more disturbing is that those in the Labor Party who said that they would support her when she made that formal complaint have instead actively supported and endorsed Mr O'Byrne.
In private support, Lions MP Jen Butler. She emailed her colleagues late Sunday, saying the silence from Labor women has been deafening and that the issue is about sexual harassment in the workplace over politics. Acting leader Anita Dow says she didn't know about the allegations against Mr O'Byrne until they were reported in the media. Speaking for the first time on the complaint, she too wouldn't comment on whether he was right to stand down.
Well, look, I'm not going to be drawn into speculation about that, Catherine.
David's made his decision to stand down as Labor leader, and now the priority for us is to look to whom fills that position.
Former leader Rebecca White is said to be the top pick among her fellow MPs. She was effectively forced out of the role in May. Still on maternity leave, she's keeping mum on whether she's interested.
The good thing for them is it's a long time till the next state election.
I hope that sooner or later they will determine who will be leading them, and that person no doubt will provide commentary on this matter.
Labor won't just be dealing with another change in leader, there's also staff turnover. Since David O'Byrne became leader just 20 days ago, several staff from the small opposition office have either left or will leave. That's not unusual when there's a change at the top, but whoever takes over will have to rebuild the office and then the party. In turbulent times for Labor, one thing is clear: there's a mammoth task ahead. Emily Baker, ABC News.
A Victorian man who swindled hundreds of thousands of dollars out of Australia's national disability provider has been jailed. Mitchell Landry was today sentenced to 3 years behind bars for scamming the National Disability Insurance Agency that runs the NDIS. In 2018, Landry made 22 bogus work claims worth $342,000. He spent the cash on investment properties and a Mercedes. Mitchell Landry must serve 16 months before he can be released on a good behaviour bond. The Northern Territory's anti-corruption watchdog has found a former school principal in Arnhem Land engaged in corrupt conduct by diverting taxpayer funds meant for students. And the ICAC has warned the behaviour it found could also be present in other remote schools across the Territory.
In the remote Arnhem Land community of Milingimbi, more than an hour's flight from Darwin, the Territory's anti-corruption body has found students and their families were taken advantage of by their former principal, Jennifer Lee Sherrington. Among conduct found to be corrupt, Miss Sherrington used charter travel on a regular basis without justification or authorisation for herself and other staff members. The ICAC report found the principal from 2015 to 2019 spent public funds on hire cars for personal shopping, dinners with family and friends, and allocated government housing to her nephew. More than $193,000 was spent on 18 unauthorised trips, and more than $270,000 was spent on salaries for family members. She also made a failed attempt at manipulating school attendance data to try to get an extra $1.4 million. The ICAC found Miss Sherrington was not in the business of education. She was in the business of manipulating data and herding children to be at school on census days to maximise funding from both the NT and Australian governments. Ms Sherrington has denied all the allegations, pointing to the challenges of remote schooling and insisting that a clear explanation was given for all the spending. But the ICAC says that's fanciful and that it fears the government's decentralised school funding model could be hiding similar cases in other remote communities. Felicity James, ABC News.
Well, a man has been attacked by a shark on the New South Wales mid-north coast. For details, we're joined by reporter Miles Holbrook-Walk, live from Crescent Head this evening. Miles, I think you're beachside. Bring us up to date.
Good evening, Hamish. Yes, we're actually at Crescent Head here, a very popular surfing spot all year round for many surfers, both in New South Wales and interstate with visitors. But just behind me, we can see Killick Creek, and out to the ocean is where the attack is believed to have happened at just around 4:25 p.m. this evening. Andrew Beverley is a superintendent paramedic. He was responding to the scene. He actually joins me now. Andrew, good evening.
Good evening, Miles.
And tell us a little bit about the incident that you were responding to here.
Yeah, we were called to a person hit by a shark around 4:30 this afternoon. We responded to ambulance crews and also the Westpac helicopter from Tamworth, along with myself. We arrived here and there was a young person who some of those guys, including some doctors I believe, rendered some immediate first aid, made some makeshift tourniquet, which was very beneficial for them.
Now, there is an understanding that he's now in a stable condition, Hamish, and he was airlifted to John Hunter Hospital, I believe, from the golf course here at Crescent Head. Is that correct?
That's correct, yes. He was a nice young gentleman. He was attended to by our doctor and paramedics on the aircraft prior to departing from the golf course to the John Hunter Hospital.
And what was his condition like when he departed?
He was in a serious, I'd say serious but stable condition. He had some significant wounds to his right arm. In all, he was in pretty good spirit.
Yes, and you mentioned that he was in good spirit, so conscious and breathing. What was the state of his arm? We understand there was a very severe injury there.
Yeah, that's correct. Again, it was a significant injury. Any more than that, I can't say. Obviously, that's left to be determined by the doctors, surgeons, and so forth in John Hunter with further assessment.
And do we know if he was a local to the region?
Look, I'm not sure where he was from. But I know he was here today, so
So there you go, Hamish. Many details still emerging out of this scene here, but we know that he's in a stable condition, and a tourniquet was prepared for his arm to try and save his arm, which was severely bitten. Do we know any matter of the shark species at this point, Dave?
Look, not from me. I'm unsure. I believe it was cited by a few people, but identification's not been made from mine.
We appreciate you joining the ABC, Andy. And that's the moment of detail that we have here right now, Hamish. As we've spoken to a few witnesses and bystanders to the matter, saying they were quite shaken up by it. He was treated by bystanders first, as we've learnt, and is now going to John Hunter Hospital in a stable condition.
Miles Hobblebrook, thank you so much for the update. Well, turning to some other news, and this small fact may shock you. Every year Australians spend more on superannuation fees than they do on electricity. The government has been introducing reforms to help bring down fees and charges, but workers are being warned they're often paying too much.
Like many young Australians, Molly Kane hasn't paid much attention to her superannuation. She's had several casual jobs and 5 super accounts.
Knowing that the money that's meant to be going towards your retirement is now non-existent because of fees that you didn't know existed, it's really sucked.
Australians spend more than $30 billion in superannuation fees every year. That's more than what we spend on electricity bills.
Unfortunately, at the moment, people are being charged really high fees for pretty poor outcomes in some accounts.
If you've got $100,000 in just one superannuation fund and the fee is 1%, that's not a one-off $1,000 payment. As your account balance grows, so do your fees. After 10 years, assuming your balance has increased to over $200,000, you'll have paid more than $17,000 in fees. For higher returns, the performance of the super fund also matters.
Over the last year, super funds are now sitting on average returns of almost 20%.
The government's latest laws allow Australians to compare the performance of some superannuation funds. Its next step will be collecting data that allows people to compare fees and performance across all superannuation funds.
Superannuation funds have been put on notice that underperforming funds are not welcome in the system and that high fees can no longer be hidden.
Molly has now consolidated all her super accounts into one low-fee fund.
Look at your account. Are you losing anything in fees? Is your money growing? Is it shrinking? Don't be afraid to change super accounts.
More Australians like Molly are taking control of their money as competition in the super industry ramps up. Nasim Kadem, ABC News.
To finance now, and a consortium of super funds has made a $22 billion takeover offer for Sydney Airport. Here's Alan Collar.
As usual, the bid for Sydney Airport is not a bid, but an unsolicited, indicative, conditional, non-binding, something or other, from IFM Investors, which is owned by a bunch of industry super funds, Q Super and New York-based Global Infrastructure Management, which owns part of Gatwick and Edinburgh airports. It's conditional, among other things, on getting access to the books so they can make sure they're getting it cheap. And while Sydney Airport's share price jumped 34% today, it stayed well short of the indicative non-binding price, understandably perhaps. And anyway, we're barely back to where the price was before the pandemic. The question for all concerned now, sellers and buyers, is how long it will take for airport traffic to get back to where it was. In fact, will it ever get back? Without Sydney Airport, the All Ordinaries Index would have fallen 0.2% today, but instead it remained steady with gains by energy stocks offset by falling banks. The US market rose 0.8% on Friday after a bigger than expected lift in employment in June. Most of the action on commodity markets was among the foods, with falls by wheat, corn and cocoa after last week's big rises, and the Australian dollar was steady at just above 75 US cents. Now, a couple of bits of economic data today. Building approvals were down 7% in May, but they're still 50% higher than a year ago, and in fact higher than almost every year for the past 30. And retail sales up 0.4% in May and also much stronger than before the pandemic. And that's finance.
Just 18 days before the opening ceremony, and Australia has finalised its team of 472 athletes for the Tokyo Olympics. The team is made up of more women than men and includes the highest ever number of Indigenous athletes. Here's national sport reporter David Mark.
It's been a long time coming, but the moment has finally arrived for Australia's Tokyo Olympians.
I'm enormously proud of this team. It's been challenging for every athlete.
The 472-strong team is the second largest to leave Australian shores, behind the 482 that went to Athens. There are 254 women, the most ever in an overseas Australian Olympic team, and 218 men. 16 team members are Indigenous, again a record number.
Oh, that's the point of the match. Game Barty.
The highest profile of them is Ash Barty, still in the running to win her first Wimbledon title. The youngest Olympian is swimmer Molly O'Callaghan, who's just 17.
Will she hang on? She will. It's a world record.
She's part of the swimming team, which is expected to bring home Australia's biggest haul of medals and includes upcoming stars like Ariane Titmus and Kaylee McEwen. But the AOC won't be making any prediction of how many medals the team will win.
The AOC did walk away from that after Rio. The feedback from the Athletes Commission was that it just wasn't helpful. Athletes put enough pressure on themselves without having us put more pressure on them.
And that's on top of the ever-present threat of COVID.
We're not being complacent about the possibility that there may be COVID-19 circulating in the village.
It means athletes won't be eating in communal areas like the dining hall in the Olympic Village.
The AOC says about 98% of Australian athletes will be vaccinated at the Games, while the overall number of all athletes and officials amongst all countries will be about 84%. That may be some comfort for Tokyo residents as COVID numbers there continue to rise. David Mark, ABC News.
Here are the top stories on ABC News. The New South Wales government says it's critical people abide by restrictions over the next few days. The state's health authorities are still deciding whether there needs to be an extension to the current lockdown. There are 35 new coronavirus cases, 24 of which were in isolation for their entire infectious period. Among them are 3 cases linked to a gathering at the Meriton Suites apartment block in Sydney. New South Wales Health Minister Brad Hazzard said supplies of vaccine are so low, people have been chasing jabs like characters in the Hunger Games films. The federal government expects to receive 2.8 million Pfizer doses this month, but the bulk of those aren't due to arrive until October. The opposition says the slow rollout is frustrating all state governments. The head of Crown Melbourne has told Victoria's Casino Royal Commission he's known since 2018 about the company's possible underpayment of gaming tax. Xavier Walsh has told the hearing he didn't raise the issue until the day after the Royal Commission was announced for fear of explosive details coming to light. And the Australian Olympic team has been locked in with 472 athletes selected to represent the country in Tokyo. The team will compete in all 33 competition sports, including the 4 new Olympic events: karate, skateboarding, sport climbing and surfing. The team includes the largest number of Indigenous athletes ever selected. While much of Australia is off limits to travellers from New South Wales, some border restrictions are easing as other states get their outbreaks under control. Let's take you through the latest changes. Tasmania has removed the high-risk declaration for Western Australia and the Northern Territory. People from these areas can now travel to Tasmania without quarantining. South Australia is lifting restrictions on people coming from Victoria, but borders with New South Wales, Queensland, the Northern Territory and WA remain closed. From Friday, WA will consider Victoria a very low-risk state, meaning travellers will no longer need to quarantine. And the Trans-Tasman bubble has resumed with Victoria, South Australia, and the ACT and Tasmania. The ban on travellers from WA and the Northern Territory will be lifted on Friday night. Well, restrictions have eased in South Australia a week after they were preemptively tightened. Authorities are breathing a sigh of relief, saying they're confident South Australia has avoided an outbreak.
South Australia has avoided the worst for now,
I agree, we dodged a bullet.
prompting the Transition Committee to ease restrictions. Hospitality venues are back to 75% capacity. Home gatherings can return to 200 people. Drinking while standing is allowed, and so are singing and dancing.
The restrictions put in place last week will be coming off, and we will be opening up to Victoria without the restrictions that have been placed for the last couple of weeks.
Meaning people can now travel between SA and all of Victoria without quarantine or testing. The State's Transition Committee will meet again on Thursday, where border rules will be up for discussion. It's likely restrictions with Western Australia and the Northern Territory will be eased soon, but authorities say Queensland and New South Wales are still a way off. A new vaccination clinic has opened in Victor Harbour, able to provide 700 vaccinations a week.
I think people are finding it hard to squeeze into their day, and so to be able to just pop over here and get it done made it a lot more convenient.
Something the opposition says Western suburbs residents should be able to do. They're calling on the government to reopen a vaccination clinic at the Queen Elizabeth Hospital, which closed after staff received their jabs.
Anything that we can do that is positive, that makes it more convenient for families to get access to the vaccine, that should be done. And clearly there is a need here in the western suburbs.
The Chief Public Health Officer says the location on level 7 of the hospital isn't ideal for a public clinic. She's confident local doctors can manage demand.
My understanding is that there'll be over 100 GPs eventually who can use Pfizer, and we're just starting that off this week.
Around 150 young South Australians have opted to get the AstraZeneca vaccine since it was made available to them, a 10-fold increase on the number of people aged under 40 who got it the week before. Stacey Lee, ABC News, Adelaide.
As debate over AstraZeneca rages in Australia, it's the Chinese-made vaccine Sinovac that's got authorities in Indonesia reassessing their strategy. The government has relied on Sinovac to immunise more than 1 million health workers. But a growing number of Indonesian health workers are falling ill and dying from COVID despite receiving 2 Sinovac shots. Our Indonesia correspondent Anne Barker has this.
Ganang Aditama's wife died from COVID-19 2 weeks after giving birth to their first child. The intensive care nurse worked at a hospital overwhelmed with the virus, though she'd already had 2 doses of China's Sinovac vaccine.
All health workers here are struggling with COVID. Maybe she died from being exposed too much.
The young nurse was one of millions of Indonesians vaccinated with Sinovac, but a growing number of health workers are dying even after full vaccination. Over the past 5 months, nearly 90 doctors have died. 20 of those had received both shots. It's raised concerns about Sinovac's efficacy over the longer term.
We're wondering if we need a third booster. Experts are investigating.
Though hundreds of fully vaccinated health workers who've fallen ill with the Delta variant have recovered.
Sinovac would have been enough, but this mutation is causing the efficacy to be decreased.
Indonesia is not the only country grappling with the Sinovac vaccine. Trials around the world had already shown mixed results and little about its impact on older people. Chile has relied on Sinovac to vaccinate almost 2/3 of its population, but like Indonesia, it's struggling with a surge in new cases and deaths.
Of all the vaccines currently available, we know less about Sinovac than any other vaccine.
Professor Toole says with a growing number of Australians opting for Pfizer, the unwanted AstraZeneca doses here could number in the tens of millions. Doses which could prove a life-saving backup for health workers in Indonesia.
We're producing 1 million doses a week in Melbourne of AstraZeneca, and the uptake is just going to fall.
Barely 5% of Indonesians so far are fully vaccinated. Anne Barker, ABC News.
Well, famine has engulfed 400,000 people in the Ethiopian region of Tigray. Despite a ceasefire, there are fears of more clashes between the federal government and the Tigrayan fighters as the humanitarian situation continues to deteriorate. Well, Tigrayan Australian Betty Desalen has grave concerns for her family in the region. She's with us from Perth this evening. Thanks so much for your time. I know you've got a pretty large family there. How are you managing to keep track of them? Are you in touch with them? Do you know where all of them are?
Thank you for having me, Hamish. No, there's a complete communication blackout even after the announcement of the ceasefire. We have lost family. A lot of Australians here who are Tigrayan have lost family. The conditions at the moment, we don't know. It's a complete communication blackout.
And so how are you trying to reach them?
We can't reach them. We're all raising awareness at the moment. We've had one contact. So I got to contact my cousin who was victim of rape by foreign Eritrean troops. Aside from that, though, most of the diaspora have had no contact to their families back home.
To explain this to an Australian audience that perhaps doesn't follow the situation as closely as you might, how do you observe what's going on?
It's extremely complex. I am well aware of that. For us, you know, everyone knows Ethiopia is this nation who has never been colonised, but Ethiopia is a country that has many nations who speak different languages, different cultures. So naturally we have internal conflict. People try to protect their language and their culture. What we see here is that Tigray held their elections mid last year, and from there this conflict has started. I think this is a huge retaliation on innocent civilians. You know, we've lost 150,000 Tigrayans, and these figures are enormous. I think the world needs to be very concerned. You know, Tigray is now at 91% famine, and we need humanitarian aid urgently.
And so those large numbers of people that have died, is that due to the famine or is that due to fighting?
That's due to the genocide. So it's due to the conflict. The famine has been man-made in the sense that, you know, we've gone through COVID, we've got locusts as well, but farms have been completely burnt and destroyed. Buildings have been completely destroyed. A lot of this is very intentional. We've got, you know, aid at the borders that are completely getting blocked. The UN even providing food aid has been from the sky being dropped down because of all the blockage on the sides. So the famine right now is a result of the conflict. It's very intentional. Which is very heartbreaking to see because we can't send money to our family. Most of them that do have money can't even go out and purchase things. So we're all watching on the sidelines and seeing this happen.
There has been an increasing international effort to bring this under control. There is a ceasefire now in place. Has the international effort made much of a difference?
Internationally, 100%. People are raising awareness. We've got America and the UN and the UK who are. The ceasefire is very concerning, and they've raised that internationally because now Tigrayans are being arrested in the capital of Ethiopia and all over Ethiopia. They're getting sent to camps and segregated from lines. I think for me as an Australian, I'm most concerned because of the lack of leadership here raising what's happening. You know, the Australian government needs to act urgently. They need to provide aid, and they need to publicly discuss what's happening back home because the ceasefire has not eased what's happening at the moment.
Is there a significant Tigrayan diaspora here in Australia? What pressure is being put on the federal government to take those positions?
There's thousands in Australia. You know, my mum and my parents came here as refugees. They fled to Sudan from a very similar conflict 20, 30 years ago. There's thousands here. We've had protests in every city. We've had exhibitions. We've all been writing letters to MPs. And as though, you know, some MPs are raising concerns, what's happening right now is it's not enough. It's not being discussed in Parliament enough. Australia can do a lot more.
Betty Desalen, we really appreciate you talking to us tonight. Thank you.
Thank you for having me.
Well, the death toll from a military plane crash in the Philippines on Sunday has risen to 47. The C-130 aircraft was carrying military personnel and crew when it missed the runway at an airport in Sulu province. All passengers have been accounted for after rescue workers searched the burning wreckage for survivors. 53 people are undergoing medical treatment, including several troops who jumped before the plane crashed. An official investigation is yet to begin. Demolition crews have brought down what was left of a collapsed residential building in Florida ahead of an approaching tropical storm. After a number of explosions, the building began to fall, sending up huge clouds of dust and debris. The building collapsed on itself, with crews detonating explosives placed throughout the lobby and basement. Search efforts paused for the demolition, but rescuers are hoping they'll now have access to the garage, which could possibly harbour survivors. A crowd had gathered to witness the event, some with candles, for those still missing in the rubble. So far, 24 bodies have been recovered and more than 120 people are still missing. Detectives in Queensland have made a major breakthrough in the 1983 murder of Patricia Carlton, 37 years after her friend was wrongfully jailed for the crime. Officers have told ABC News they now believe convicted Northern Territory murderer Andrew Albury, who previously confessed to the murder, is responsible for viciously beating the 24-year-old with a metal pipe. And a warning to our Indigenous viewers, this story contains images of people who have died.
He spent 6 years in jail for a crime he didn't commit, now further vindicated over the cold case murder of Patricia Carlton.
I was a bit shocked in that. I didn't know what to say and what to do. I just pretty dumbfounded.
After a 12-month investigation, detectives are now confident convicted Northern Territory murderer Andrew Albury allegedly killed the 24-year-old during a stopover in Mount Isa in 1983.
He knew certain things about the manner of death. He knew certain things about where the death occurred, and he was able to provide us a mud map of where the death occurred. Those things, we allege, could only have been known by the true killer.
The young woman was viciously beaten in the head with a metal pipe, brutalised with an object and left for dead behind a pharmacy adjoining the car park of the Mount Isa Hotel. Her beaten body was found the next morning. She died in hospital. Mr Condren was charged with Miss Carlton's murder despite being in custody that night for public drunkenness. At the time, police said the attack happened before his arrest. The new investigation alleges it occurred about 2 hours later.
So that's part of our brief, is that there is a Caucasian person speaking with Patricia around 7 p.m. And of course, Mr Condren's been in custody for an hour and 10 minutes at least by that time.
Mr Condren later alleged police bashed and verbaled him into a confession. His conviction was set aside and he was freed in 1990 after his murder charge was withdrawn, but he still lives with the trauma.
He started having nightmares, so he was pretty shook up.
Police must now consider whether to apply to the Attorney-General to extradite Albury, who's serving a life sentence for murder and never to be released.
A court process is not easy, and these people have been through a lot. And I have to consider, for what gain would we have?
Police hope the allegations against Albury will help bring closure to the family. Melanie Vujkovic, ABC News.
Former inspectors from Victoria's gaming regulator have told the ABC's Four Corners program they were prevented from investigating money laundering at Crown Casino. 5 former inspectors have spoken out, saying the regulator knew crimes were being committed and their attempts to expose them were undermined. Steve Kinane reports.
Preventing criminal infiltration of Crown's Melbourne casino is a key responsibility of the state's gaming regulator. But 5 former inspectors have told Four Corners how they were prevented from carrying out this most important task.
A lot of the things that we would report up the chain of any sort of criminal activity just disappeared into oblivion. We never heard of anything further about it.
Peter McCormack is a former senior inspector with the Victorian Commission for Gambling and Liquor Regulation.
I felt that Crown were running our office. When they wanted things changed, things got changed.
Money laundering at Crown has been repeatedly exposed by the media rather than the regulator.
Money laundering has been going on at the casino for many years, and the regulator has known about it for a long time.
As scandals emerged, Danny Lacassis was part of the dedicated team that was supposed to monitor money laundering at the casino.
We were never encouraged to look into money laundering. If anything, we came across it ourselves. We'd put it up to our manager, and our manager had put up many times to senior management, but it fell on deaf ears.
The Victorian Royal Commission, due to report in October, has heard more allegations of money laundering. Its terms of reference do not include a direction to examine the failings of the state-based regulator.
The Victorian gambling regulator has been a lapdog, not a watchdog.
No one from the VCGLR, the Andrews government or Crown were available for interview. The former inspectors hope that by speaking out, it will lead to a regulator that Crown fears. Steve Kinane, ABC News.
The National Film and Sound Archive in Canberra has been gifted a rare glimpse into the younger years of acting and dance legend David Gulpilil. This NAIDOC week, the NFSA is releasing the footage from more than 40 years ago. And a warning, this report contains images of Aboriginal people who may have died.
For decades, this Super 8 film was forgotten, languishing in a backyard shed in Townsville. It wasn't until Gavin Gilman decided to digitise his home movies of his time in Hawaii more than 40 years ago that he stumbled upon the visual treasure.
It just seemed to me that maybe more people than just our family would be interested in having a look at that.
The 6-minute recording shows a young David Gulpilil performing a traditional dance at an Australia Day celebration in Honolulu in 1979. A glimpse of the actor, dancer, painter and storyteller before he was truly famous.
This footage is really rare. We don't have anything else like it. It's sort of from a pretty early point in Gulpilil's career. It was 1979, so it was 3 years after he would have done Storm Boy.
Mainly because in latter years you saw Gulpilil go on to do fairly tremendous things, and then we realised, hey, you know, way back there 40 years ago we saw this guy when he was probably just still developing his art, and we thought that it might fill a niche.
Now, just in time for NAIDOC Week, the footage has been donated to the National Film and Sound Archive for all to see and enjoy.
A home movie or something like this is a way of seeing another side of a person who's extremely significant. David Gulpilil is such a legend, and so it's really important. It forms part of Australia's collective memory.
A time capsule of the past, as well as a poignant reminder of the enduring nature of Aboriginal culture. Madeline Austin, ABC News, Canberra.
Well, your sports news now. Australian Ben O'Connor has won stage 9 of the Tour de France by more than 5 minutes to record the biggest victory of his career. The WA cyclist launched a solo attack on the 145-kilometre journey that included 2 gruelling climbs in the French Alps. The 25-year-old won a stage of the Giro d'Italia last year, but this is his greatest triumph.
Brilliant Ben, an ovation for O'Connor.
It's mind-blowing. It's what you dream of. It's so fulfilling and there's so much joy, and I've managed to control myself now compared to when I crossed the line.
Congratulations. Now the win moved O'Connor into second spot on the overall standings, 2 minutes behind Slovenia's Tadej Pogačar. Geelong will be without one of its biggest names for several weeks after scans confirmed Jeremy Cameron has re-injured his right hamstring. Cameron was subbed off in the second quarter of the Cats' big win over Essendon and begins his rehabilitation program with no confirmed return date. The star recruit has kicked 28 goals from just 10 games after leaving the GWS Giants. The Western Bulldogs are also counting the cost of their win over North Melbourne yesterday. High-flying forward Aaron Norton will miss the club's clash with Sydney after being concussed in the second quarter. Maroons coach Paul Green has made a host of changes to the State of Origin side as Queensland desperately tries to avoid a Blues series sweep next Wednesday. 19-year-old cowboy Hamish Fido will debut in the centres and inject some speed into Queensland's attack, which has managed just 1 try so far this series. Kalen Ponga returns at fullback after injury ruled him out of the first 2 games. Valentine Holmes moves to the wing at the expense of fellow cowboy Carl Felt. Andrew McCulloch's also been axed with Ben Hunt to start at hooker, while AJ Brimson returns as Queensland's bench utility. David Fifita's also been named on the interchange, but must beat a dangerous contact charge at the NRL's judiciary to play. And it's been a day to savour for Australian golfers, with Cameron Davis and Lucas Herbert both winning titles. Davis forced a three-man playoff in Detroit with a spectacular final round, 67, before sealing his first US PGA Tour victory and a $1.7 million payday.
I've been in some good positions before, but to play the golf that I played coming down the stretch was just awesome.
Earlier, fellow Aussie Lucas Herbert won the second title of his career with a three-stroke victory at the Irish Open. And there was cause for celebration on the women's tour as well over the weekend, with Steph Kyriakou winning performance on the European Tour in the Netherlands. Time for a check of your weather now. Here's Graham Creed.
Wet weather is mostly confined to the southwest of the continent, also the west coast of Tasmania. This is due to a series of cold fronts, particularly through Western Australia, where we're looking at the possibility of some fairly widespread moderate falls about the western and southern parts of the coastline. For Tasmania, it's a moist onshore wind flow about the west and south of the state, but elsewhere relatively dry underneath this high, but very cold underneath it as well. There could just be a very isolated shower about parts of the northeastern tropical fringe. The coastal areas, elsewhere clear, dry and sunny with frost over the southern and central inland. Widespread frost anywhere away from the coastal fringe through New South Wales. With a generally dry day, there will be some cloud around, but no rainfall associated with that. We've also got a frosty start for the day across much of Victoria. We're also looking at generally dry conditions, perhaps an isolated shower about Wilson's Promontory and also the southwestern coast. For Tasmania, the bulk of the showers will be about the west and the south, should remain dry through much of the north and northeast. South Australia also looking at a generally dry, mostly sunny day. Some frost areas, particularly through the east and north of the state. For Western Australia, though, it's the opposite. Widespread showers, cloud, possible localised moderate falls about the west coast down to around Albany. Also the possibility of some isolated thunderstorms. Drier conditions across the north, but very cold, dry air is keeping those minimums well and truly down across central Australia.
Well, remember, you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on iView as well. I'm Hamish Macdonald. More on our top stories coming up in a moment. Stay with us here on ABC News.
If you give